Hi, guys and gals. Greg Howe, S9 Radio, and thanks for tuning in for yet another Retro Radio. This is a weird one, a review of a review and a restoration of a restoration. Yes, that's right. And you just listened to an audio clip sent to me by Canadian client Bill of a newly acquired and freshly restored $1,300 CPI CP2000. Now, if you think that sounds crazy, it gets a little worse. Have a look. Bill actually paid much more than $1,300. There was some PayPal transfer fees, but as mentioned, he's a Canadian. He actually paid $1,947 and change. Yes, that's right, with the Canadian exchange rate. So if you think that's a horror story, shipping to California from Canada, Ontario, I believe is the region, isn't cheap either. So that puts this well in excess of $2,000 out-of-pocket expense. Not only did this high-dollar restoration show up with transmit audio beyond horrible, it also had another very annoying problem, and that's the partial illumination of a segment in the digital channel readout that stays partially illuminated no matter what channel you're on, going to full brightness when it's actually supposed to be illuminated. Very, very annoying. Now, like any right-minded purchaser of a used, claimed to be restored working radio for this kind of money, any amount of money, he got right back in the seller's face, who informed him he was departing on his annual 3-month vacation and would be unavailable. But here, I'll send you some alignment and test notes that I took just prior to shipping, and here's a few places you might want to look for problems. If you're not technically inclined, take it to a technician who is, as he goes on vacation. Wow. Really? Are you serious? Man, oh man, I think I'd be jumping in the car and heading out on a road trip. So anyways, Bill's left stranded. He finds what he believes is a reputable shop. Guy's been in business 49 years, a ham radio operator, licensed and everything. And Bill gets this, really depressing news. The guy reviews and assesses the radio and says, hey, I'm just going to put it back in the box. At this point, the amount of work required goes well beyond that being a, feasible, cost-effective restoration. And then he goes on to point out several capacitors were replaced unnecessarily. Well, wait a minute. These CP2000s are almost a half-century old. Call me crazy, even though I'm college-educated electrical engineering major, any piece of electronics, whether it's new, old stock, or whatever, that is over 20 years old is due for polarized capacitor replacement, meaning tantalums and electrolytics. So unnecessarily replaced. And wrong values. Well, newsflash. I just restored and recapped 2 CP2000s in the last 10 months. Let's just say in the last year. I don't even need to look at a parts list to know the values. I've owned these and serviced many. Every single value of replaced capacitor is correct. It almost leads me to believe this guy, I blacked out the names, I'm not going to name any names, was looking at the wrong radio, but he says the case has been repainted with automotive paint and there's a slight scratch, and that is exactly true. And according to the client Bill, that scratch occurred from this guy writing up this god-awful review. And then he's also going on to say the primary issue with the horrible sound that you just heard is caused by the power supply, which shows severe lack of regulation. Really? That was the first thing I check when I get a radio on the bench. And Bill had mentioned this, but after Bill had actually emailed me this, what we call a punch list of problems, I went back and I tested again, not just, with a a DIVM, but actually with a scope looking for ripple current. And the only thing I can think of, this guy that wrote up this claiming about the regulation, it's rock solid, by the way, was using some sort of test instrument that was being affected by the horrendous amounts of RF these things are capable of generating, although it's the alignment looked pretty good. Actually, the original restoration of this is beautiful. I can't say a bad thing about it other than the fact it arrived in a not very good functioning form. But just for starters, you can see the restore has replaced these, sometimes these connections, these RCA jacks can get a little intermittent. And these are accessory jacks for frequency counter and whatnot. So he's replaced them with some nice gold ends. And then also he's replaced the SO239 jack with a silver plated unit. Nice touch. He's put a CPU fan. I hate fans. Not a big fan of fans, pun intended. And I'm not quite sure the purpose is there really is no exhaust or ventilation, so you're really just kind of recirculating the warm air. These don't get hot, and that could be a good thing. It stabilizes other components, but even if this fan did have an exhaust or an intake vent, they're really just dust pumps. I'm not fond of, not my deal, and not really necessary. And then he's also added some heat sinking to some of the logic chips that run a little warm. This is TTL, completely normal from the run warm, and then also a heat sink here on the EEPROM. Nice touch. I don't think it's really necessary, but anyways, I can't see any, components that have been swapped or incorrect. So there's my review of the review. Yeah, if we're really talking about the same radio, this is the craziest review I've ever seen. Hard to imagine that punch list of problems not being about this radio, as it does have a recreated CPI label. It does have a really nasty scratch. So let's see if this thing actually is restorable, or in fact, that punch list of problems is correct. So anyway, Bill, after the arrival of your radio and your phone call refreshing my memory on what the last shop and technician had given you a write-up of all the issues, with the main one being the power supply being unstable and unregulated, which I had already checked that, but you sent me their actual documentation. I thought, what? You got to be kidding me. So anyways, here's a quick look at what you've got going on. This is the 5-volt supply. They indicated everything was unregulated. This is the power supply that powers all the chips. And it is not adjustable. It's coming in at 5.13. That's fine. There is no adjustment for this. And then we can move on to the other test points that are adjustable. We've got 10 volt. Let's see what we've got here. And that is an adjustment, or adjustable. Now your radio has traveled considerable distance, so to be off a tenth or so is fine. And in the precision alignment, I'll bring that back to 10 volts. But that is not going to hurt anything. So anyway, now I've moved over to the 14-volt regulated supply with the Fluke scope meter probe. I've also got the scope and a digital display going. Just looking for ripple currents and voltage instability and things like that, on which the last shop / technician was saying was unstable, unregulated. So here we go with a little regulation test. I'm in the AM mode, as you can see, and looking into a Bird 43 watt meter. Got a 10 watt slug going into a PERD Tourmaline 50 ohm dummy load. So here we go, key up. There's unkeyed. There's keyed. Couple tenths of a volt difference. Completely normal. If that's not regulated, I don't know what is, but let's go worst case. We're only doing about 4.5, almost 5 watts on this in the AM mode. Let's kick it up a notch. Okay, now we're in the sideband mode. Easily pegging out the 10 watt slug once again into a Bird Tourmaline dummy load. Full whistle on sideband. Now I'm unkeyed, keyed up. full whistle. If that's not perfect, beautiful regulation, I don't know what is. This story just makes no sense. I told the owner it's almost like this guy had to have written up a worksheet on a different radio. But if it wasn't for the, the paint job on the cover mentioned, I would say, yeah, it is a different radio. There have been times here where I've had a couple CPIs. They all look the same, but there's no doubt in my mind he wrote up this worksheet on this radio, yet I'm not seeing any of the issues. I don't know if these two shops or whatever had some history, but oh well, this is one for the books. Stay tuned while I get it all sorted out. I mentioned I would go through and start looking at man-made, technician-created errors. I have found a electrolytic of reverse polarity. That arrow normally, well, not normally, always points to the negative lead of the capacitor. This one is installed properly. You can see that little dot on the circuit board. That indicates positive polarity. And as you can see, the negative of this capacitor is going away from that dot. So the positive of this capacitor is correct. Now let's look at what we've got here. We've got an arrow indicating the negative polarity going right to the dot. Reverse polarity. Seems to me, if recollection serves me correct, CPI did make a mistake on one of these reference designations on a capacitor where it actually needed to be installed backwards. I don't believe this is where it was. I thought that occurred over here on the SMO board, but I'm going to check my notes. But anyways, I'm also going to check the polarities of all the rest of the capacitors just to make sure everything is copacetic before I really start taking the deep dive into the actual circuitry. And yes, both a quick check of my notes and the schematic indicate that C290, this 2.2 UF, was definitely installed backwards. Okay, Bill in Canada, I sure do appreciate you sending this radio all the way to California, and you won't be disappointed. Anyways, I found your culprit. I'm going to pat myself on the back a little. If you remember one of our phone calls, I told you it sounded like voltage starvation, maybe VCO, or AGC circuit was clamping down, possibly a bad capacitor installed backwards. Well, yes, it was a bad capacitor. And it was this bad Motorola chip. This is your AGC chip. And I kind of danced all around it, looking at signals, actually listening to them, and was getting some pretty weird signals, both on the scope and audibly. I was sniffing signals out with a little earbud, having a listen. And this chip really seemed to be the culprit. And when removing the chip, I saw evidence that the factory had been in there with a Dremel tool. And apparently there was a batch of boards, and this was one of them that was under etched. In other words, there was some extra copper clad left behind that shouldn't have been there. And you could see they Dremel tooled it and tried to remove some of it. And I'm speculating there was just a little burr. And if you look at this picture closely, you can see it almost touches. And I suspect at one point it probably did, and that's probably what popped the chip out. And then, much like a fuse, that little whisker burned itself out. But anyways, the damage was already done. The chip was no good. I popped another one in that I had in stock, and problem solved. And it's loud and proud. Have a listen on channel 19. Hello 1-2. That is clean and clear. You have no distortion. I don't have the compressor on. I've got the mic gain barely cracked open, although I've got the mic gain on your microphone up. And also, I should mention, in the early stages of putting the radio through its paces, I found a fairly common problem, and that was an erratic compressor circuit, usually the fault of the switches because they get so little use. I went ahead and hit it with a treatment of D5 deoxidizing contact cleaner. And I also went around to the back of the switch and found some marginal hairline fracture on the solder. So I went ahead and reflowed, put some external flux on there and reflowed the solder, ruling that out. And since then, I've hit it with a few repeated treatments of deoxit, and that problem seems to have cleared itself up. Okay, it's my understanding that this CPI had the display replaced or something of that nature. You can see we've got a little flicker of a segment that actually lights up much brighter. So it's either a leaky display driver or a multiplexing issue. Anyways, just happen to have a pair of display drivers, 7447s. Even though it's only one digit with the segment partially illuminated, best to replace both display drivers at the same time, ensuring the displays will have equal brightness. That doesn't always happen when you mix and match brands and date codes. So that's the reason I keep them as pairs. Anyways, time to get to it. See if I can't get rid of that very annoying extra little segment illumination. Wish me luck. All right. I love it when a plan comes together. I pretty much had this radio diagnosed over the phone. Bad logic driver, just as expected. Remember we had a little segment that liked to not extinguish all the way? Yeah. So there you go, Bill. How's that? Less than a 24-hour turnaround on one of the most sophisticated radios to ever hit the 11-meter airwaves. I've got to say, it certainly helps to have all the parts in stock and no shortage of TTL in this kid's parts bins. Lots of old school parts here. And about the only thing left to do is slap my seal of approval on here, which I'm going to do right now. S9 Radio, celebrating 40 years of fixing other people's headaches, and been very successful at doing it.